Good morning, everyone. Happy to have you here at Thursday Morning Torah. We're always happy to have you at Thursday Morning Torah. And Thursday Morning Torah is always happy. Except when the events in the Torah aren't so happy, which is not the case this morning, actually. But in order to get to what we are going to talk about, we will need to just review a little bit about the life of Jacob. Because in this morning's Parsha Vayishlach, it has one of, really more than one of its peak moments. But of course, the narrative always begins before the peak moment, unless you consider birth a peak moment, in which case the beginning of the narrative and the peak moment are identical. Before I continue, however, I do also want to just remind you that we will not be here next week because of Thanksgiving. So next Thursday, there is no class. Whether that is a cause for thanks or not that there's no class, I will leave to you as I try to call up. I'm trying to call up the broadcast on my phone so that I can see your comments if you make comments. There we go. Now we're here. All right. So Jacob, as you will recall, starts his life as a twin. There is actually an interesting paper that argues that Jacob and Esau were a particular kind of identical twins. For those of you who are interested, one of the comments on my Facebook page to this week's Parsha cites that paper, which is interesting to read. But whether or not they were identical twins, and I think the general consensus is that they're not. They are twins, and therefore Jacob and Esau start life together. But they're very different in temperament and in outlook. And as you'll recall, early on, Jacob has made food. He's made a lentil stew. Esau is a creature of impulse and says he's starving. And Jacob says, well, I'll sell you the stew for the birthright. And Esau says, fine, I don't care. I'm not paying attention. I just want to eat. And then later on, there is some sense that Jacob's purchase of the birthright isn't legitimate because he has to fool his old blind father in order to get it. This is done at the instigation of his mother, Rebecca, and he steals the birthright. And when Esau comes back, Esau is wild with grief and rage and swears to kill Jacob. Jacob very sensibly runs away from home. And then he comes to the home of Laban, where he meets Rachel and Leah, ends up marrying Leah and then Rachel, although not intentionally. He means to marry Rachel, but ends up first with Leah or Leah, and then has children and becomes wealthy, and hears that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 people. Now there are two somewhat connected events that happen subsequently. So first of all, Jacob, when he hears this, plans a strategy to appease the brother that he knows is angry at him. And his strategy is to send out gifts and family, gifts to say, look, I share with you and I give you and I make you feel better. You always feel just kindly disposed towards people who give you stuff. And also to send his family out because they presumably will touch Esau's merciful impulses. After he divides up the camp, it says, Vayivater Yaakov levado, Jacob's left alone. And then we go on to read that a man struggles with him until the coming of the dawn. Now, as you can imagine, for such a powerful story, mythically, psychologically, spiritually, there are many, many, many interpretations of what this entire episode means. In part because Jacob comes out of the episode with a new name, and he becomes instead of Jacob, he becomes Israel, and Israel means one who struggles with God. So there is something divine about the being with whom he struggles. And in fact, the modern psychological take on this, of course, would be that since Jacob is left alone, he struggles with himself. The guardian angel, because the rabbis assume everyone has a guardian angel, at least certainly biblical characters do. One of the arguments is the guardian angel of Esau, and the struggle actually takes place there. And Jacob defeats Esau in that battle. That's another reading of it. And then, of course, there is the reading that the angel isn't just an angel who struggles with Jacob, and Jacob, by prevailing, shows that he has become a different sort of person from the person that he was before, and he emerges with a limp. There is one school of interpretation that actually some renowned medievals subscribed to, that it was a dream, and that the limp is actually still a result of the fact that the dream was powerful enough that it had actual physical effects. But whatever the origin story of the person's psychological phenomenon projection that Jacob struggles with, what is significant, of course, is that Jacob becomes different somehow. His name changes, his character changes. When he holds on to the angel and says, "I won't let you go until you bless me," and the angel says to him, "What is your name?" The astute reader will recall that the last time Jacob had to answer that question, he lied, right? He told Isaac that he was Esau. Now the angel wants to know, are you going to actually be who you are? Because that's the first step to changing, is reckoning with who you actually are now. So Jacob says, "I'm Jacob." He says who he is, and he says, "No, now you're Israel." So Jacob does change. And on the next morning, interestingly, the text signals this by telling us that Jacob goes on ahead of the camp that he's divided up. He originally said they were going to go first. Now he goes first, because now he has the confidence to face Esau one-on-one. And the question then becomes the question that we're going to spend at least a few minutes exploring this morning. The question becomes, so why doesn't Esau kill him? Now, those of you who read my Facebook or Twitter will have seen, although I didn't put the link up today, I put the PDF from the Jerusalem Post magazine, that this is the subject of the Torah column, as is often the case now with the class and the column. But I want to give a couple more explanations than I gave in that column to the question, because it's something that is not a monocausal event. There are lots of reasons one could give why Esau doesn't kill Jacob. Coming with 400 men seems to indicate that he wants to kill him. And the last time they saw each other, those were his last words to him, is, "By the way, next time I see you, I'm going to kill you." And we do know, by the way, that there's a different, we see this in numerous stories in the Bible and in ancient societies. There's a very different relationship to the violence in society than we have now. Like, you would not now expect a brother to come with 400 people and say, "I'm going to kill you," and make a big public event of it. But in ancient times, such things were not unheard of, and the level of violence was far greater. And the possibility that Esau was coming to kill Jacob is very, very, very high. So along comes Esau and Jacob, and they see each other, and instead of killing him, Jacob and Esau fall on each other's necks and weep. Now, the rabbis, for a variety of reasons, one of the reasons is there are dots in the Masoretic text above the word in their meeting, is the rabbis assume that one fanciful midrash says that Esau actually bit Jacob. He didn't kiss him, he bit him. Those marks are teeth marks. Others say that Esau remained hostile to Jacob. But that's not the sense of the text. The text is they see each other and they weep. And the question is why? What changed Esau's mind? I mean, after all, he knew it had been many years, and you could simply say just the power of seeing somebody after all those years is different from one's imagining. But it's a pretty dramatic change from killing somebody to weeping in their arms. So one phenomenon that has two different explanations is Jacob's limp. The medieval commentator, the Rashbam, says that Jacob is known for running away. That's what he does. When he has a problem, he runs away. When he was home and he stole the birthright and Esau got angry, Jacob ran away. When he became wealthy with Lavan and was afraid that Lavan was going to try to take stuff from him, he ran away. But now Jacob can't run. And Esau sees the runner, the fleer, the avoider of responsibility, standing up and taking responsibility. And that's what changes him. This is Rashba. Benno Jacob, who was a German rabbi of the early 20th century, 19th, 20th century. So before the Holocaust, but still a rabbi in Germany, and was familiar, obviously, with some of the conditions that developed into the Holocaust, said Esau sees that Jacob is not the arrogant young thief that he was. Jacob is diminished. Jacob is wounded. Jacob limps. And therefore, he doesn't have, the anger drains out of his heart because he's no longer seeing this arrogant, defiant, and hateful person that he remembers from his early years. Both of those explanations have a lot of plausibility to them. It may also be, by the way, that Jacob, in fact, because he has his family behind him and his wealth behind him, that even though he goes off ahead, Esau sees everything that he's accomplished and done. And Esau, too, has done well. And to see that they've both done well out of that very unpromising beginning, maybe that is what calms Esau's heart. And then you have the explanation that I've mentioned a number of times that my father offers, that in the ancient world, you didn't have mirrors. So people didn't see themselves, which we do all the time. And here were two people who were twins, even though they weren't identical twins, they were twins. And so Esau looks at Jacob and he sees a picture of himself. This is who he is, after all, because the identification with someone else who's born at the same time as you, exactly the same time, and who's lived the life with the same parents, it's only the two of them. That's very powerful. So he sees in Jacob a mirror of himself and sees all the years of hatred and estrangement that the two of them have experienced. And having seen all of that, he falls on Jacob's neck and he weeps. Now, I want to follow one thread, and this thread actually is suggested by Jim's question, that when Esau gets angry, Jacob doesn't attempt to respond to it by saying, look, you sold me the birthright. there, first of all, may be distinctions between what it is that Jacob's agreed to take and what it is that he gets from his father. That's one thing. That the firstborn son and the birthright, the firstborn son legacy and the birthright may be somewhat different. But then there is also the question of the entire relationship between two brothers who are very different, but still have a kinship. And you see this with Isaac and Ishmael as well, right? They are two brothers who are different, but they have a certain kinship. Because remember that they come back together to bury their father. And it's not as though Isaac and Ishmael in particular ever themselves had a falling out the way Jacob and Esau did. But nonetheless, the question of family, which I think is a fascinating question all through the book of Genesis, and with Thanksgiving coming up also has its own power. The question of family is how you relate to people who share something that no one else can share, right? What I have shared, for example, with my brothers, I have three brothers, the memories we have, the origin that we have, nobody else in the world shares, right? That's inimitable, that's unique. And yet at the same time, you can be very, very different from members of your family. And while there is this core connection, there is also sometimes a tremendous difference of temperament, of values, of fate. So, I recently listened to a podcast by a woman named Nancy Siegel, who studies twins for her professional work. And she was talking about identical twins who've been raised differently. Sometimes, as in the famous cases with the Louise Wise Agency, deliberately, but sometimes for one reason or another, just turned out that way. And some of them, sometimes they will be raised wealthy and some will be raised poor. And the difference that creates in their both bond and distance from one another. She actually was involved in the most famous case, which out of the University of Minnesota, where one of the twins was raised as a Jew and one was raised back in Germany as a Nazi. And despite that, and despite the, obviously, I have to tell you, the tremendous differences of outlook between the two of them, it turned out that they actually related to each other very well and had a good deal in common and understood each other, and the ways that they processed information were similar, and so on and so forth. And this is a phenomenon primarily of identical twins, but not so much of fraternal twins. And yes, so Jim anticipates where I'm going, which is that you see this phenomenon very much with Joseph and his brothers. And we will come to that starting next week. But again and again and again, the Bible talks about the similarity and the difference of brothers. And I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that the reason the Bible emphasizes this over and over, that you can't, especially the book of Genesis, but before you get to the world stage, before you get to the Exodus, before you get to the desert and Revelation and setting up a state and David and Solomon and on and on and on, before you get to that, the reason that the Torah focuses repeatedly on brothers is that in that relationship, sibling, not necessarily brothers, sisters, in that sibling relationship, in microcosm, is the question of humanity. That is, others are like you, but they're different, just like your siblings are like you, but they're different. And how you accept, negotiate, rebel against, embrace that similarity and difference is the moral quality of your life. So when you when you decide how you're going to treat the people who are close to you, that says something often about the way in which you'll be able to relate to others who have a greater degree of distance and intimacy. Sandy Kress mentions Levinas, who actually I quoted at the end of my Torah column, that they're meeting, Jacob's face is so very changed that the other passing before the same, saying, please, after you, sir. Levinas was a French Jewish philosopher who placed tremendous emphasis on the face, that the face of the other is what makes moral demands of me, and that in the face of the other is the essential component, ethical component of, well, we would say the Jewish tradition, but I think you could also just say of human moral life. Because think of Esau and Jacob getting together. I mean, think of the power of that moment. It's remarkable. In that is a real snapshot of a whole host of human questions. Here are two very different people. They would think of them in today's terms. I'm sure they would be on different sides of the political spectrum. They live different kinds of lives. They have different values, but they're family. But they are family. And the question in that moment, in the moment that Jacob meets Esau, is what will predominate? What will count more? That they're different or that they're family? And I think it's important to say that it's Esau that really makes that choice, right? For Jacob, there's not a choice to be made. Jacob wants to be close. Jacob doesn't want to die. And Jacob has no quarrel with Esau, right? If anybody did anyone wrong, and that's a separate question, I think did, but nonetheless, it's clear that Jacob is the one who did wrong. Esau didn't do any wrong to Jacob. And so Esau is the one who makes the decision to prioritize basically love over hate, familial connection over estrangement and anger. And so I think that this is a story that has a tremendous amount to teach us, especially now, when the culture of distance is so powerful and so persistent. And the ability to see reacha kamocha, that someone else is like you, is very strained in our time. And also in a time where values are weapons. That's what people use them for, as opposed to as values. They enunciate a value just to show how their opposition doesn't follow it. So all of these things, I think, together make this a very, very powerful story. And the idea that that the Torah begins again and again with sibling stories, and starts, of course, as we remember, with the first sibling story, which results in a murder, right? Shows the polarities of the distance and the closeness that are possible, and all the variations therein. Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, at the end, Ephraim and Manasseh, who accept the disharmony of having the older submit to the younger. The Torah plays with, if you'll allow that term, it plays with all the different variations of the possibility of these familial relations, all in the end, obviously trying to lead us toward the idea that the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau is what matters, is what is good in the world, and what allows, of course, Israel to continue and to flourish. So Alana says Esau didn't wrestle an angel, he changed on his own. Well, first of all, I don't know. We don't have the history of Esau, but that is possible. It is possible. And there are lots of ways, after all, of wrestling, and lots of ways of changing. So it would be, I'm sure it's been done. I'm not familiar with it, but it would be very nice for somebody to write a story of the life of Esau. What did he do in all those years between the time that that Jacob ran away and the time that he saw him again in all those decades. Remember that Esau was the one who was left. He was left at home. That's another reason for resentment, right? I stayed home and took care of mom and dad while you ran off and had adventures at Lavan's. This is, and this also falls under the category of in chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. The same kinds of recriminations and tensions and difficulties that exist in ancient times still exist today. And I don't believe that I have ever had the experience of talking to a family where if they're open enough and honest enough, they don't show the cracks in the fault lines. That's just the, I know that the term dysfunctional family is very overused. I don't know that there are functional ones in that sense. There are families that do well, but are there families without pains and difficulties and estrangements and angers? And the comedian Kathy Landsman, I never forgot this line. I heard it years ago and I've quoted it since. She said, holidays are a chance to renew your resentments afresh, right? That's, people get around the Thanksgiving table and the old fault lines appear all of a sudden. So this is part of what it means to have a family. And I want to say the Jewish people are a family. So they have that on a large scale, they have that. And they, Frank Ariel wrote very beautifully, if you can see it on the Sinai Temple Facebook page. He says, my brother and I are very different from one another. At times we've also quarreled and even held grudges against each other. But when I see him and embrace him, there's a feeling of immense proximity and connection with him, where it all makes sense, other than where it makes all else, other than love, simply disappear. That is both honest and beautiful, Frank. Thank you for that. And I think that that is, for many of us, that's what matters, right? And I hope on Thanksgiving that that's what many of you, if not all of you, will feel. That for all the tensions and all the difficulties, families, especially siblings, have to make this way through the world together. And God willing, we'll be able to rely on one another, and that same core feeling can be, can reach out into greater and greater concentric circles. And we can make the world a little bit more familial. Okay, are there any final questions that people want to ask before we wrap it up for this morning's Torah class? Going once, going twice. Well, this Shabbat morning, I'm going to be talking about face-to-face and elaborating on some of the themes that we talked about today. I hope that you will join us on Shabbat morning. I'm so glad that you joined us today. And remember that these and other Torah classes and other sermons and so on are available on the Sinai Temple website in perpetuity, or at least until the internet explodes, which could be any day now, who knows? Or until the metaverse, I should say, comes to an end. So we are here and grateful that you're here, and I hope you have a beautiful Shabbat, and hope you have a meaningful and